Hi, and welcome to History and Culture Cluster's second roundtable conference for the month of December. For this time, we'll be discussing the topic of historiography and how history is recorded, and the elements that go into recording history, and what and in the modern day, can we go back and re-record history, and what kind of biases and problems come up when we try to do so. We hope that you find this discussion to be enlightening. To start this off, I would like to pose a question to the people assembled here about what do we understand by the idea of established history and what are some of its obvious shortcomings? Aditya, please start us off.
Yeah, I think so. Established history is basically anything that's mostly in the written form as to how things have been in the past and how we keep perceiving it in the future. But I think there is a difference. There is a um, change in how history is being perceived because as scholars or historians, I think they do not believe that there are very clear or simple explanations to what have happened in the past. But as people now tend to understand history, they often oversimplify it and distort it to the point of some sort of corruption where they like to assign responsibility or liability or even blame to certain narratives. And it is often understood that there needs to be a moral hero, there needs to be an immoral culprit. So they like to think that with their own nations, the societies need to be more advanced and tend to have a false sense of cultural superiority over others based on historical narratives. I think that's one thing that I understood when I was reading and understanding more about the established history and the narratives around it.
A bit more of a technical question, but do you think the nature of a source, the nature of a primary or a secondary source, impacts its contribution to established history? And by that I mean, say if it's a literary source versus a coin, that is kind of a literary. I mean, not a coin. Say uh, architecture architecture or folklore compared audible present in art folklore rather than just written down on some leaflet folklore. Do you think the first one takes precedence in how established history is observed and reserved and written down?
I think if you're talking about architecture and about heritage, that is, I think, can be taken as primary evidence because it has not been tampered with. It was what was present during that time. But with written history, it's not that written history is not a very verifiable source. It is. I mean, most of our history is based on written history, apart from the one that we consider as oral history. But when we talk about written history, there is also a sense of bias that might creep in into it. And these biases tend to form a narrative which might lead us to a path of maybe destruction.
Uh, Vishwa, please go ahead.
Yeah. So, in my opinion, so there is a difference between what kind of source that we use for um, making or writing of history. So, so, so if we take quotations or personal experiences of the past historians, obviously there is some credibility to it. But I think, in my opinion, we should give more weightage to the facts or the archaeological evidences more as compared to quotes or written histories because yeah, as pointed out earlier by Aditya, they may be open to some interpretations, but in case of hardcore facts you cannot challenge them. Like, it is what it is.
It's interesting that you bring up the idea of hardcore facts, because so my one of the history professors in JSLH, and he said something very, very poignant, I feel. He said that there is no truth in social sciences. There is only truth claim, and rather this, till a certain extent, holds true even in sciences. There's only truth. I mean, because of of the absoluteness of sciences, there is what we call truth. But knowing all the facts, this is the truth. That is what we try to put forth in social sciences. But I believe the problem, I believe in what I've understood from history by constantly being a person who studied it, is that even in the way that we record facts, even in the way that we give precedence to certain facts in certain groups and certain kinds of sources, we are creating a narrative. So if you look at written down sources, who had the agency to hire people to write down sources in a clay tablet? They were rich people. They were the ones who were creating and manufacturing facts for the future. Uh, that's that's even an idea that holds true for literature and the idea of canon. It's people in power who support and legitimize art of a certain period that contributes to the idea of canon or to the idea of classicalness. So I think the same element in a way that's why we have, I think, a certain casteist look at history. I really found it interesting that you use the word facts, because that's the thing about social science. We constantly even question what these facts are, right? Anvesh, I saw your hand go up. Do you have something to add?
Well, I would say that the way of looking at history is our goal should be to come at the closest approximation of the truth, if not the truth itself. So, to align or present history in such a manner that aligns with all of the available evidences that we have at this time. Uh, there is such a thing as established history, but we have to distinguish different kinds of established history. So there is an established history that is advocated by the state, the established history that helps in nation building, as it were, the history that you find in school textbooks, which is established, which promotes a certain kind of narrative, because its goal is not to present you with an unbiased view of history. Its goal is to make you into a citizen who believes in the national myth. Nations don't have history, but as soon as nations are formed, they lay claim to an ancient history. So even though nations are modern constructs, they lay claim to histories that are ancient. This is something that Timothy Snyder
That's
has also pointed out.
that's a beautiful
Uh,
point.
yeah,
No, that's a beautiful point. Like, oh God, I mean, nationalist struggle in India was constantly finding roots to Ashokan Dynasty. 1,000 years in the past. How are you relating to it? How are you? But it allows us, stories form nations, right? Stories form nations. And history, may you need stories. You want the reformed guy. You want the guy who was like, oh no, no more war now. I'll become a better person now. All of that stuff. So anyway, moving on to the next question. What are some of the recent incidents of rewriting history that we've seen, and how do you think they contribute to this discussion and to the discussion of established history at large? Vishwa, please go ahead.
Yeah, so just because you mentioned Ashoka and I had something interesting to share about it, so just really going back to that. So as you said that he saw the war and changed it, changed himself, but then there have been certain discussions or debates that say that he had converted before he went to the war, and so there is all these and these are like inscriptions that you can find. So there is there is a lot of change that needs to happen because what we still consume is supposedly outdated.
Completely agreed. Completely agreed. I was just attributing to the whole idea that we need that story, right? We need that
Yeah.
religion change this person's story. Anyway, Anvesh, please go ahead.
yeah, no, just slightly adding to Viswa's point, that what he said is actually true, and I think it is by now an established fact that Ahsoka, the entire change of heart scenario was basically made up to create a certain thing. And you find this actually in the works of Upinder Singh, who was the first person to argue about this point, that Ahsoka, before that he did not change his religion. He was a Buddhist before he came to Kalinga. to, where his change of heart was supposed to happen here right now in Bhubaneswar. So I think that we create these narratives to have a national hero, as we, a national hero who supports the national myth, not so much as to propagate, let's say, the closest approximation of truth.
Vishwa, please go ahead.
Yeah, and just coming back to the question about established history. Sorry, I'm deviating again. But uh, so you said about the shortcomings of it. So I remembered a few instances in the Indian context. So if we so the shortcomings are that a lot of it is still colonial in nature. So if we there have been instances where people have referred to maybe King Samudragupta as Napoleon of India. Maybe so. Some people may see it as a compliment that the Westerners or foreigners are referring to him as Napoleon, but there is some hidden truth behind this because Napoleon, even though he was a great thing, at the end of the day, he was defeated by the Britishers. So when they refer a Indian king as Napoleon, it is not that they mean to compliment you or maybe yeah, but in the sense they still want to emphasize that they are the ultimate rulers. In fact, and also if we see a lot of the established history or the short in our history textbooks, that is still dominated or centered around Delhi. So its shortcoming is that a lot so rest of the Indian regions happen to be ignored, especially northeastern India, where, like, for example, the Ahoms ruled for like almost 700, 800 years. Even though still we know more about Mughals who were like there only for like 150 years. So yeah, these are some of the shortcomings that just came in my mind.
Oh, that's certainly interesting. Samragi, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, in terms of giving instances, I was thinking about, the whole in 2021, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he sort of declared 14th of August as the Partition Horrors Day. And it's very interesting because 15th of August is considered as the day of joy, the day of freedom. But 14th of August, that is the day of independence for Pakistan, you sort of claim that that's the Partition Horrors Day. And when you describe something as the Horrors Day, you you know sort of connect it to pain and sorrow, and somehow you try to place the onus on them for the entire thing that happened. So this is something very interesting I was thinking about. And secondly, something like taking down the statues of white supremacists in India, or even changing the names of old cities, even though these two instances are quite different. But I could also think about similar sort of patterns. The first pattern I could think about was in terms of, trying to talk about the us versus them dynamics. So you try to deviate yourself away from them and try to establish your claim over something that does not resonate with them but resonates with you. So, and secondly, it's also the language of victimization. So, in the first case, when you take down the statues of the white supremacists, you constantly say that, we cannot worship these people, we cannot keep these statues because they are the ones who colonized us. So, we are the victims. And in the second case, when you talk about something like changing the names of the old cities, in most cases, these are the names that are Islamic in nature. So, for example, Allahabad was changed to something I can't remember right now. But basically,
Prayagraj.
right. So the new name meant a holy place for the Hindus, a worship place for the Hindus. So you constantly try to, and also Adityanath, he said that, we can't let the Muslim invaders define us. So here also you try to make yourself the victim by saying that we have been invaded. So we are the victims here. So this language of victimization constantly comes up when you are rewriting history. So these are some of the things I could think of.
Okay, so the 14th one, I really didn't know. How many of you knew about the 14th one thing? If you could just raise your hands. Am I audible? Yeah, yeah. I was asking how many of you knew about the whole 14th one thing. I really didn't know. I never came across me. Yaar. It's a very fascinating thing. Huh? It's a very underhandedly fascinating thing to do around 14. Wow. You have to give credit to their creativity. Yeah, so that's kind of what I actually had a fight with someone that brought me to this question. The whole renaming cities, because the claim is the same, right? To rid us of the influence. So, Vishwa, please start, go ahead.
Yeah, and so adding to that point of victims, but it is also very true that a lot of history that we have had is of our invaders, and what and it is also essential to study that, but then it is also not right to ignore our kings or what the our history like of our people has been. And so coming to that, um, we somewhat need a society which comes and agrees to certain, like, takes in evidences and collects data from everyone, like, and then writes it down. So to give you an example of what I'm talking about, in South Africa there had been a truth reconciliation society after the apartheid had ended and it got independence. So this was basically just a normal commission which had members from both the black community and the white community, and then they took evidence from or evidence from like everyone, and then they sat down and wrote the history, or maybe like set some parameters for the country to be, so we could adopt something similar in India, maybe. And in fact, I just came across this news that the Indian Council of Historical Research has launched a project to rewrite India's history. Like it wants to give due credit to all the dynasties who have been missed out and correct texts that have been written in the Eurocentric ways, and it has already been started, and the aim is to complete by around 2023 or 24. Now I don't know on what basis they are going to write this and who are its members, but yeah, I just read it.
Certainly a lot to add. Aditya?
Yeah, I mean, talking about a bit about white supremacists and how their statues have been taken down in Western countries. Uh, I want to give a small example where I think the very famous tennis players Arthur Ashe's statue was put in Virginia, and how there were a lot of protests during, I think it was around 1996 when the statue was established. And there were a lot of protests because where the statue is located, there are also many statues of Southern generals, of the Confederate generals. And many people felt that it wouldn't be right for someone who is a foreigner of American and African rights to be put together with such people. And I think that led to like a very big protest where people from the South were like, this is our heritage, and cultural bigots cannot take over our heritage and all of that. And this happened again in 2021 with the whole Black Lives Matters movements, where people started vandalizing the whole statue, writing White Lives Matter. Uh, Eventually, the statues of the Confederate generals were removed. I think that I think someone had said that as the more we look into the past, the better we can understand the future. So it is maybe necessary to embrace the moral deconstruction of the past, maybe rewriting it, and so that we can understand our future and improve it better. So yeah.
That's certainly interesting. Anvesh?
I think we need to make a distinction between rewriting history and erasing history. So, the instances that we're talking about are instances of erasing aspects of history, let's say erasing aspects of white supremacy or whatever. And that is a different kind of revisionism than, say, rewriting history, which at times needs to be done and is appropriate to be done. So, for instance, what Viso pointed out, the fact that we don't learn about other regions of our nation. I did not come across the name Odisha at all in my history textbooks throughout the 12 years that I studied it. So, does that mean that Odisha is not a part of India? Even though the fact is that all of our regions have had international connect, as it were. Odisha has a strong maritime connection with, Indonesia and Malaysia, and the Greater India, as Sheldon Pollock calls it. We don't learn about a lot of aspects of that. And even when we learn about, for instance, the freedom movement, we learn about only one aspect of it. We don't learn about the fact that there was another freedom movement, the revolutionary movement, which was which advocated a form of violence, which believed in different radical theories, whether it was of Marxism, whether it was of anarchism, and in many aspects even of Hindu nationalism. All of those aspects have been erased. So there is, when we talk about rewriting history, I think we need to give credit where it's due. So the grievances that a lot of Hindu nationalists have, as it were, is not completely unjustified. But the answer to one established type of history is not to form another established type of ideological history, is to create, if make, advocate for a kind of history which shows all aspects. So one can make their own decision as to what heroes you follow, what villains you follow. So I trust the judgment of our audience instead of treating the reader as you know mute spectator.
Aditya?
Sorry, that was from previous. Yeah.
No, Anvesh, I mean, I think it's a great point that you raised because if you look at ancient Indian history, you look at the fact if you're talking about Mahajanpads, but you're not giving precedence to which states and how they contributed what these Mahajanpads, the 16 Mahajanpads, and what their contributions were in the ancient times. We just think of ancient history as we are teaching it, as we're reading it, in terms of dynasties and names, not in terms of cities as cultural centers. And to move on to it, central CBSE, while yes, state boards differ in what they teach, which not that much. State boards do differ to a certain extent in what they teach to their states ke bacche, but Central Board of Education prioritizes a North Indian form of history. It focuses on Mughal Empire. It focuses on partition struggle in the northern hemisphere. And then, okay, that might be a personal thing because I'm from these families, but I have heard 90% time, 99% times more about Punjab's experiences of partition than I have about Bengal's experiences of partition. I highly doubt the only reason for that is the fact that I'm from these areas. I highly doubt that's the case. But we rarely read about Abdul Ghaffar Khan. We just brand him as the Gandhi of the East and then we move on. But what about their works and their contributions during these times? I mean, we prioritize only history that has, in a way, contributed towards the colonial nationhood aspect of it. And I feel a lot of that has to do with the fact that it is this kind of history is also tied into Hindi itself. Because even if you look at Mughal period, the language of the people at that time was Hindustani or Urdu, or I mean, I'm not sure, but I think the court language during Akbar was Persian, but people were not never really speaking Persian, right? No normal person of the subcontinent was speaking Persian. They were speaking versions of the language mixed with Hindi dialects. At the time of partition, India's language was Hindustani, and which was spoken in North India, not in South India. Nor was it spoken in East India, nor was it spoken in Northeast India. It was spoken in North India, in the Hindi belt, as they say. So it is certainly interesting because we geographically we have decided this is the history of the country. Uh, we have decided morally that upper caste history is the history of the country. We we learn about the Bhakti movement in such a upper way that yes, this was, but I mean, Bhakti movement did not come out of nowhere. It was coming out of constant struggle. So So I feel like that's what brings us to the third question. What other forms of history are there? So when I was writing this question down, I was thinking of subaltern forms of history. So like the idea of feminist history and the focusing on women's movements and focusing on women's experiences during it. Like even if you look at the Mughal period, how were women navigating their households and their within villages? So I feel like comparatively that is covered by comparatively, and I say we use that word very s- cautiously, in at least in what I was taught in 11th and 12th. But I would really like to welcome your perspectives on the idea of different forms of history. Does anyone feel like starting us off? Let's just go over one by one. So, Anvesh.
Um, so I don't adhere, or personally, I wouldn't like to adhere to a particular framework, whether it's the subaltern framework or the dialectical materialism of the Marxist or the feminist framework, because I think that in itself is limiting. So it only allows me to see aspects of history, perhaps aspects of history which are not talked about, but only certain aspects of history. So I would like to uh, these different forms of histories that we're talking about, we need to create a form of history which takes the best aspects from all of these frameworks and combines them into one. So that would give, in a sense, that it would give us the widest sense of what is happening, what's true and what's not, or what has been ignored, let's say. To keep that confined to one framework would limit us in terms of the periods that we choose, in terms of the heroes or figures that we choose, and the struggles that we choose. So I think that is the problem with established history, and if we are going to adhere to another kind of history, it's going to lead to the same sort of problem. Having said that, I also believe, because you pointed out uh, the case of Hindi, I would like to add that it is funny that Hindi, we call Awadhi or Brajbhasa and all of these things dialects of Hindi, when in fact they existed long before Hindi did. Hindi is a recent language. It formed in 19th century. It formed after Urdu, by the way, and Urdu is also a recent language. So when we're talking about, say, the Mughal times, we're not talking about either Hindi or Urdu. We're not even talking about Hindustani. We're talking about Rekta. We're talking about Hindavi. We're talking about Awadhi. These languages which continue to exist, but which are derided as uh, local dialects, as it were, when in fact, when they existed, they were the languages of the elites. Khusro wrote in Brajvasa, Khusro wrote in Awadhi, Tulsi Das, all of these great writers, they did not write in Hindi. They wrote in these different languages because there was no Hindi back then. So it gives us a glimpse into how history has been sanitized. So, how when we look back, we look at the history of the past through our present contemporary lenses and frameworks, as it were.
I mean, that's the idea, right? We're anachronistic about it. When we rewrite, when we talk about this established history, we talk about the most truest picture, or we talk about the simplest picture in many ways. And that's anachronistic because we constantly think of it through today's eyes. As I made the same mistake, I was thinking of it the Hindu belt because that's what we call it, the Hindi belt, the Hindi belt, where people speak a similar form of language. But the fact of the matter, as you've pointed out very eloquently, is that these dialects and these languages have existed long before Hindi. Hindi comes in last, right? Hindi comes in even after Hindustani and Urdu. It comes in after all of it. So, it comes in after the whole sanitization process happens, and when we make Hindustani more elite in the 20th century. So, I think of it through today's eyes because that is what we speak. Like that is, which is not the case because in every state and every city and every, you find of course ignoring just, do you find a different dialect of speech. So similarly, you mentioned widening our scope, but don't you think a certain amount of will increase the kind of generalizations we make when we widen the scope? Uh, I'm of the perspective that a barrage of depth perspectives, so say a feminist history and history that looks into the um, tribes of India as and the Indian state and the conflicts between the two as a colonial venture. All of these different forms and different perspectives of history would, while it might be a more tedious process, will come to provide a better understanding of it. Because if we go for a more widened scope, don't you think we'll be making more generalizations, more easy answers?
Okay, so I'll give you one example. So, for instance, a Marxist historian, when he looks at the past, he will only look at the past through the lens of caste issues, class issues. And when he does that, he will miss out the conflicts which happen due to caste. And in fact, what he's going to do is he's going to look at the conflicts that happen due to caste or religion and attribute a class aspect to it, even though class has very little to do with it. But when we do a sort of overall framework, when we take the best out of these issues, then we can uh, analyze conflicts that have happened in the past through the lens that suits them most, through the lens for which we have most evidence. Some conflicts may have happened due to class issues, others may have happened due to religious uh, extremism, religious reasons, others may have happened due to caste issues. So this can only happen if we widen the framework, as it were. Reducing that framework to one particular issues is going to lead us to uh, keep all of the events of history into one bracket, which is not fair and which is not accurate simply.
Vishwa, anything to add?
I'll just like to like re-emphasize my point about the um, Truth Reconciliation Society about South Africa. It's something that we can adopt because like having representation from like every party and coming to a consensus, I probably see it as the only way to satisfy a majority of the people. Otherwise, there will always be people who say that this is not the truth, or maybe these people have been ignored. So, in a large sense, um, um, gathering people and coming to a agreeing to a particular point is the only way, in my opinion.
I really find the fact that you brought up truth reconciliation interesting because when I was learning about truth reconciliation committee, I learned of it in a very different light. So we did it during when we were reading Disgrace. I remember that book because of how freaking traumatic the whole experience of reading and discussing it in literature was.
Which
But
one, J.M. Coetzee?
yeah, that one. Oh God, I hated that book. Oh, especially as a queer woman, I hated that book. Through, uh, can't like I remember missing a class. I was online. I remember missing a class because of how deep and hard the discussions got. And yeah, so we were talking about the Truth Reconciliation Committee, and Jem Coetzee brings up a very interesting way of putting it forth. I think when he trigger warning, I'm so sorry, when he sexually assaults the student, and they ask him to sign something acknowledging what he did, and that would be considered an end all, right? I think it's in the first couple of chapters of the book only before he goes to live with his daughter. And that's the way he put it was, see, we didn't get it, all right, we none of us in the class got it, we were idiots, but our professor pointed it out and she was like, the relevance of this is the fact truth reconciliation committee was acceptance, right, in many ways of the horrors enacted by the racial elite onto people of South Africa. But what what material good did it lead for? Like, people went through their experiences, and yes, from an outside perspective it sounds like a beautiful exercise. It sounds like something to hash out all of our wrongs, but it seems like a very unfair compromise for the side of the person who's gone through this experience, right? It's just I'm acknowledging your pain. It's the same problem people face with social media, where people are just like, I acknowledge your pain, but there's nothing being done for that pain, right? For my experiences. That's just, I remember remembering when you mentioned truth reconciliation, I just went back to that class. And where she was saying something. Were you, or oh, okay, I was just hallucinating. Okay. uh Saragni, you've got to tell me. I'm so sorry, I keep on messing up your name. Please tell me how to pronounce it.
Yeah, it's Samragi. Just the N is silent. So it's
Silent. Okay, I
Samragi.
got. Okay, I'll remember that. I'll try to.
Okay, I don't have anything to add right now.
Aditya.
Yeah, like when we were talking about alternate inquiries into history, I think there are multiple branches to that alternate inquiry. Also, there is historical revisionism. We have alternate history as a separate subject of history, and we also have something known as counterfactual history. That's something I want to talk about. Maybe it's that counterfactual history is where we deny the existence of a certain part of history, and we look if that event haven't hadn't happened, what would have happened, and how that would have shaped our future. I think it's not a very broad field as of now, I think, because I think in the past it had been explored for a bit. But there is, I think, this one paper that talks about railroads and American economic growth, where they deny that railroads had ever been invented, and they check out the possibility of how America would have developed without railroads. And they found out that with the canal system that they had, they would have reached several same level of per capita income in maybe just a few months difference. So it helps us to understand about our past and also about how the future would have looked if we had like invested in something else. There's also another, I think, author, historian known as Niall Ferguson, who looks at Marxist theory through the counterfactual lens. And I think his point was how Marxism would have adopted to a real world, like the world right now, about how it would have gone around and how it would have been a decisive moment in the world's history.
We started having a similar discussion during history class, and our professor, and we were having the discussion of what if the Indian state had never been formed, and what if the Indian states and Indian cultures existed like the EU does, like a coalition of sorts, but they all retain more autonomy over their cultures. And we were discussing, we were going too deep into it, and he just told us to shut up and say, this is not happening now, na. But it certainly brings into perspective that the whole idea of the butterfly effect, and how impactful was this one movement in this one period of time, and was it really? Is it really that one thing that changes history, or is it a constant barrage of things that forms it? uh, and that's what I think even professor was trying to get us to understand, that it's never one thing. And even though it would be interesting to consider, what if there weren't railroads at this point in time in history? What if the Indian state ever formed? You would still have instances within states of identity cleansing. Think about it, like it's not like there is an identity of just UP, or just, you would still have identity cleansing happening. You would have tribal identities being diminished, caste identities being diminished, maybe at a lesser, you know uh lesser, what's the word for it, lesser par, maybe, lesser, but they would still happen. I think that would be my guess. Is there anyone who wants to add something? If not, we can conclude the discussion.
So I on the part of identity cleansing, I think that, well, it's still happening. It has happened throughout the years in multiple states. In Maharashtra, the Shiv Sena came to power through a xenophobic movement. Let's not forget that. And it wasn't a xenophobic movement directed at Muslims, by the way. It was a xenophobic movement directed at South Indians, non-Marathis. In Assam, we witnessed Bengal Kheda, the 60s and 70s, the entire xenophobic movement, which resulted in ended in 80s through Rajiv Gandhi's compromise. So we have seen multiple instances of xenophobic movements of towards other ethnicities, towards other religions, towards other people who speak different languages. So we've seen that in our country as well. But it is important to note that no state in the world, no nation state has formed without an aspect of violence. So the fact that India was formed, the India that we know as now the map of India, forgetting about partition, that was formed with such low level of violence that all of the states acceded to the nation state of India mostly without violence, bearing, of course, the Hyderabad, the Nizam case of the Nizam, is a miracle. And Pratap Bhanu Mehta points this out as well. And I think we should recognize that, and the fact that we have had such little violence overall in our nation formation means that we can survive as a nation when we go forward. So the goal now must be to retain that. And second, I would just like to plug in the fact that uh, on rewriting history, there's been a lot of new books that are coming out and previously ignored figures, and some of these new books actually come out from, for instance, William Dalrymple's The Anarchy came out recently, and in that he demolished a narrative that Sirajuddaula, we consider him as this sort of hero who was betrayed by Mir Zafar, when in fact Sirajuddaula was a tyrant. He tortured people, nobody liked him, and the people of Bengal, the people where he ruled, basically celebrated the fact that the British won because they were free from this tyrant who was torturing them and who was corrupt and who had no regards for them. So we need to understand these aspects of history as well, and we also need to pay attention or critique properly the Hindu nationalist version of history, which is coming out through, say, Vikram Sampat's biography of Savarkar, which is, by the way, I think is very well researched and as a must read. But there needs to be proper critique of that. There needs to be proper critique of Meenakshi Jain, and there needs to be engagement with these works because these are works of history which are properly well researched, which are based on primary research, which bring out facts which weren't available before. So we need to relook the entire narrative that we're framing and critique it properly.
I mean, I feel like Anvesh, you're a more hopeful person than I when you talk about the Indian identity. I hope and those turn out to be true. I hope we can retain that idea of unity and Indianness throughout. I don't see it right now. Maybe I'm just a very anarchist person, but yeah. Anyway, thanks for coming for this discussion. It was a pleasure having all of you. We'll see you again next month.